Good morning. It's great to be with you this morning. It's great to see all of you here in this room. Welcome also to those who are participating with us online today. We're glad that you're here. Glad to be able to worship God together. So if you're into history, you might find this interesting. In the 1860s, there was a man named Emerson Stone. You might not have heard that name before. Emerson Stone was a captain of what was called the 25th Massachusetts Division of the Northern Army during the American Civil War. So as you know, I'm sure the 1860s were a time in our own country's history where we were at war with ourselves. Those were the days of North and South, blue and gray, the Civil War times. And Emerson Stone played a small but significant role in all of those battles. I think that his story might be one of the best I've ever heard from those times because it's a story of unexpected kindness. So it all started in 1862. That year in North Carolina, there was a battle called the Battle of Roanoke Island. And Emerson Stone's crew, the 25th Massachusetts, they were a part of that battle. In fact, they defeated soundly their southern enemy. It was called Wise's Legion, named after their captain, Henry Wise. Well, Wise's Legion just gets totally scattered and defeated. People are running in every direction, and many people from that southern army were captured that day by Stone's company. And this is the part where the story gets really interesting to me. Here's what one soldier from the north side wrote about that day. He said, "It was interesting to see how freely our boys and the rebels talked after the events of the day together. The prisoners and the Union boys would often get together and talk about the day's events with perfect good feeling. And sometimes the rebel prisoners held prayer meetings in which our boys would join. What a singular circumstance. Killing one another a few hours before, now praying for one another that each other's lives might be spared." Well, word starts getting around about how well Captain Stone and his northern group had treated these prisoners that were taken captive from Wise's Legion after the Battle of Roanoke Island. In fact, the kindness of this northern division was so evident and so surprising to so many people that historians have actually found this record on the posted on a wall of a Confederate stronghold in the South. There was a note that said, "We, the uncommissioned officers of Company K, North Carolina 8th Regiment," that's Wise's Legion, the ones that got away, "do give our thanks to Company A of the Massachusetts 25th, that's Stone's division, for the many acts of kindness shown by their company to us. And if it is ever in our power, we will return the same." Wouldn't you know it? 2 years later, 1864, May the 15th, these two divisions find themselves across the battlefield from one another again. Only this time, the results of that battle are completely the opposite. The first time, the Northern Army routed the Southern one, took many of them prisoner. This time, it's the Southern Army that has a sound victory over the North. They take many, including Captain Emerson Stone, who was wounded in battle. They take them captive themselves. The same people who 2 years before had seen some of their own taken captive by this group. And this time we get to hear from Emerson Stone himself what happened next. He says, "My captor, upon learning what regiment I belonged to, at once declared his intention of standing by me and doing for me all that was in his power to alleviate my suffering. Right royally did he fulfill his vow, for no one could have shown greater kindness than he showed to me. He bound up and staunched my wounds at first, then brought water to refresh me. Reaching the hospital, he asked the surgeon in charge to look after my wounds. Then, taking from his shoulders his own blanket, he carefully placed it under me and bade me a feeling goodbye. This is the last thing he said. I've often regretted that I did not learn the name of this whole-souled man whose large heart was filled with humanity, although covered with the rebel gray. And I would today, after the lapse of so many years, give the best $100 I ever saw for the privilege of grasping him by the hand, my kind captor, who so faithfully stood by me, though an enemy, in my hour of sore distress. Now, isn't that quite an amazing turn of events and story about unexpected kindness? The kind of kindness that reaches across the lines that divide people from people. The kind of kindness that really stands out. That story came to me from a book by a historian named Daniel Rolfe, who wrote a book called My Brother's Keeper, Acts of Mercy During the Civil War. And the book itself is sort of an amazing testament because it is page after page after page of stories, just like Emerson Stone's stories of people showing unexpected kindness to their enemy, who at the very same time is also, in a sense, their brother. And after compiling story after story and account after account of these true events, the historian Daniel Rolfe concludes it all with this. It says, of all the things I've learned in my lifetime, the one with the greatest value is that unexpected kindness is the most powerful, least costly, and most underrated agent of human change. Kindness that catches us by surprise, brings out the best in our natures. I wonder if you would agree with that. I wonder if Jesus would agree with that. Because doesn't Jesus, in his own way, say that same thing when he tells his most famous, maybe, parable? It's the one in Luke chapter 10, if you want to get out a Bible and turn there. Hayden read the beginning of it, the setup for it to us a moment ago. This is the parable that Jesus tells when somebody asks him, who is my neighbor? So Jesus says, suppose a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers who stripped him and beat him and took off, leaving him half dead. Now, by chance, a priest was going down that road. And when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise, a Levite, when he came to the place, passed by on the other side. And you already know this story so well, so many of you. I didn't even tell you which parable, what it was called, but you know who the next person who's going to come by is, don't you? You know who's coming next. A Samaritan. One of the enemy. Someone who comes from the opposite side of this north and south division that has plagued the people of Israel for so many years now. A Samaritan, while traveling, came upon the wounded man, and when he saw the wounded man, he was moved with compassion. And so he shows the man an unexpected kindness. Actually, he shows him about 16 of them. If you want to just count all the verbs of the things that the Samaritan does. He went to him, and he bandaged his wounds, and he treated them with oil and wine. He put him on his own animal. He brought him to the inn. He took care of him. He apparently seems to spend the night there because it's the next day. He's still taking care of him. He took out 2 of his denarii, his own money, gave it to the innkeeper, and said, take care of him, and when I come back, because he plans to come back, I will repay for you whatever more you spend. And after telling his parable, Jesus then takes that question that started it all, the one when the man asked him, "Who is my neighbor?" And he just kind of just lobs it back to the same person. He says, you tell me. Which of these three, the priest, the Levite, the Samaritan, do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? What does the man say to that? What makes a person a neighbor? Not proximity, not even similarity, but activity. It was the one who showed him mercy. That's who the true neighbor was, says the man. And so Jesus says to him one more thing. He says, go. Now, throughout the summer, you know that we've been looking at stories together based on this same theme. We're looking at passages together where Jesus says go, and we're asking what happens when people actually go when Jesus says go. Like, what really becomes of that? What can God do with that? Well, this parable belongs in this series because the last thing, the final word that Jesus says at the end of this great parable is go. Go and do, is what he says. Go and do likewise. Now, I know that many of you have heard this parable a whole bunch of times. If I were to guess that you'd heard it 1,000 times, that might be an exaggeration, but maybe not by much. I myself preached on this parable not that long ago. I think it was about 1.5 years ago. Let's call that the 1,000th time that you heard it. About 6 or 8 weeks ago in Mark Samsel's Bible class, he talked about this parable. That would maybe 1,001 for you. So what do you say about a parable like this one when you know that many people like you and me are hearing, this is hearing number 1,002 of this parable? Like, what do you say about it? I've been wrestling with that this week. So I settled on just saying 2 things. One thing is about that word do in Jesus' final statement. The other thing is about this word that follows it, the word likewise. So let's do this word first, the word do. Starting to sound close to a Mountain Dew commercial. Let's do the do here. Talk about this here first. When Jesus says go and do, don't you think he's saying by that this can actually be done? What Jesus says here in this story, is it possible to live this way? To be a good neighbor like this, to put compassion into action even toward one's enemy. Jesus says, go and do. Can this really be done? I think we know the answer to that. Because in countless ways in history, through the stories we know of people like Emerson Stone and many others, and through our own lives, we have seen and heard of people who showed unexpected kindness, mercy in action, even to a so-called enemy. Maybe one interesting way to think about it is like this. Think about who it is who's the very first person to hear it. When Jesus, at the end of this parable, says, go and do likewise. Who is the first person? Who's he talking to when he says that? The first person to hear him say, go and do likewise. Who is it? It was the teacher of the law, right? That's who started all of this when he came to Jesus and tested him, an expert in the law. This is somebody who knows backwards and forwards the Old Testament scriptures, someone who knows backwards and forwards the story of Israel. I wonder when this expert in the law is listening to Jesus tell this parable, and he hasn't heard it 1,000 times before, like we have, I wonder if little alarm bells are going off in his mind. If he's starting to make some connections here. I don't know, but I wonder if he thought about this story. From 2 Chronicles 28. This is what we might call the original Good Samaritan story. So picture this scene. It's Civil War times in Israel. There's north and south. In the south, there are these people, they're called the people of Judah. In the north, there is this group, they're called the people of Israel. They used to be, and in some ways still are, one people. They together were rescued from slavery in Egypt. They together inherited the promised land. They together were these 12 tribes who were united as one because they came from one family, all the way back to the call of Abraham. But along the way, they split up and divided, and this hostility began to fester and grow between them. They became a divided people, the north and south. And at this time, the people in the south, they have this wicked king named King Ahaz. In the north, they have a king who's just about as bad. The northern folks live in this region called Samaria. And the people who live up north, some of them will become the ancestors of the Samaritans, who grow to be those people that the Jewish people have so much hostility toward. So in the days of this wicked king Ahaz, Judah, the southern part, fights with the people up north, and they just get totally defeated. Verse 6 of the chapter tells us that 120,000 of the people of Judah died in one day. And verse 8 of the chapter says that the people of Israel, the ones up north, took captive 200,000 of their kin, women and sons and daughters. They took all their stuff, too. They took all the spoil from them, and they brought all of this to Samaria. Their plan is to make these people that Chronicles calls their kin into slaves. But a prophet of the Lord was there whose name was Oded. And he went out to meet the army that came to Samaria and said to them, because the Lord, the God of your ancestors, was angry with Judah, he gave them into your hand. Judah got what was coming to them for their wickedness. But you have killed them in a rage that's reached up to heaven. Now you intend to subjugate the people of Judah and Jerusalem, male and female, as your slaves. But what have you except sins against the Lord your God? Do you understand what Oded is saying here? Maybe think about it kind of like that time when Jesus stoops down and he starts to draw and write in the stand, and then he gets up and he says, he who has no sin, you throw the first stone, right? That's kind of what Oded is saying here. Oded says, Judah may have been punished for their sins, but don't you know that we are like them? Don't you know that we are sinful? Just like they are? And don't you know that these enemies are actually your own family? That's the next thing he says. Verse 11, he says, now hear me and send back the captives whom you've taken from your kindred, for the fierce wrath of the Lord is upon you. Basically, Oded says, look in the mirror. Aren't you sinful too? Look in the mirror. Don't you see the family resemblance between you and them? Don't treat them harshly. Don't make them your slaves. Send them home. That's what Oded says. And something even better happens. There are 4 people who are looking on that day, and they're listening to what Oded said. Verse 12 calls them certain chiefs of the Ephraimites. It calls them by name. There's Azariah, son of Johanan. This is going to challenge me, this next verse. There's Berechiah, son of Meshillemoth. There's Jehezkiah, son of Shallum. There's Amasa, son of Hadlai. All of your Bible reading days, you might not remember these names at all. But these are, in a way, the original Good Samaritans. These 4. These men of Samaria. They hear what Oded has to say. They see the captives that have been brought from their own kindred. And they stood up against those who were coming from the war. And they said to them, "You shall not bring the captives in here, for you to propose to bring on us guilt against the Lord in addition to our present sins and guilt, for our guilt is already great." And there's fierce wrath against Israel. So the warriors left the captives and the plunder before the officials and all the assembly. Then those who were mentioned by name, our Good Samaritans, got up. They took the captives. And with the spoil, they clothed all those who were naked among them. They clothed them. They gave them sandals, provided them with food and drink. They anointed them. And doesn't this part make you think about the Good Samaritan parable? Carrying all of the feeble among them on donkeys, they brought them to their kindred at Jericho. Even Jericho gets mentioned in the parable, the city of palm trees. And then they return to Samaria. Now imagine you're the expert in the law. You know these old stories backwards and forwards. Could he have made the connection? He's an expert in the scriptures. Is it possible that he remembers the 4 real-life Samaritans, Good Samaritans, that did these things for his own people in actual history? If he does remember, if he makes the connection, then when Jesus says go and do, then he ought to know that it can be done. This may be a parable, but it's not just a story. It may be a parable, but it's not just hypothetical. The Good Samaritan has a name, you could say. 2 Chronicles 28 did 4 names. An unexpected kindness, what we might also call mercy, is something that is truly shown in the real-life choices of real people. Something people actually do. Go and do means that it can be done. And so, we ought to try to do likewise. This is the only other thing I'll mention this morning. If that first word, go and do, was a reminder to us that these things can be done, then this last word, likewise, ought to remind us that we ought to try to do them. We ought to try to show mercy, unexpected kindness in similar ways in our life. Likewise. That's a word that means similarly, or in the same manner, or in the same way. When Jesus says go, he says go and do similarly. So let's end by asking some questions about that. First question, why? Why should we choose to live this way? I think there's probably many answers to this question. We could take the 2 that 2 Chronicles gave us. One of them was because we're sinful too. just like the people we encounter in this world. We could take that route that humbles ourselves and remembers what we have in common in that way. Or from 2 Chronicles, we could learn that even our so-called enemy might have a little more family resemblance to us than we first notice. All of us being created in the image of God, we could certainly see how that could be true. Some other reasons why could come from our parable. Going and doing likewise is how you hold the greatest commandment, right? This is a parable about the greatest commandments, which are love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. And this guy says, how do you do that? And Jesus says this, do likewise. The very first question in the parable is, what should I do to inherit eternal life? Jesus says, do this. Be like the Good Samaritan. We might think of even more reasons why. We might think about how Jesus at the cross did the same for us. The unexpected kindness shown to us in Jesus might cause us to say what that group from my first story said, if it's ever in our power, we will return the same. A lot of reasons why we might try to live this way. So what about how, then? It might be a good question to have. This one may not be one that we can answer with just the most specifics because of that word likewise, which reminds us that the ways to live this out are frankly endless, so long as we are bringing the mercy and the kindness of this story into the lives of the people we meet. Maybe the best thing I can say about how is with open eyes, with a willing heart. We may have to keep our eyes open as we walk the roads we walk so that, we're not like the people who pass by the chance they have to go and do likewise. There was the priest and there was the Levite in the story. I'm sure that I have been that priest and Levite many times before, probably because I didn't have my eyes open. Maybe my heart wasn't willing. The question I'm most excited to ask about this today is, what would happen if? What would happen if we go and do likewise? It's the question of this series. When Jesus says go, what happens if we actually do? Would we find that unexpected kindness, mercy, really is the kind of thing that changes lives? Would we find that unexpected kindness is the most powerful and in many ways most available and most underrated agent of human change in the world? Would we find that the Good Samaritan can have 1,000 names? And one of those names can be yours. Maybe this speaks to you today. Maybe what you need today is to respond to the unexpected kindness of Christ shown to us, which is what we do when we respond to the gospel. We experience his mercy. He binds up our wounds, and by his wounds we are healed. Our sins are washed away. Maybe what you need today, we could put a lot of words on this invitation. Jesus didn't put a whole lot of words on his invitation. His invitation was what we just talked about. It was plain and simply to go and do. Go and do likewise. Maybe that's what challenges you today. Let's contemplate and respond to Christ's unexpected kindness and his call to action while we stand and while we sing.